Juan Mendez Scott's The Guest Room. Chapter 7. Where my husband and my best friend made love. I got off work early that afternoon to pick up my car. One of the salesmen at the dealership came to pick me up from my job. I drove a gunmetal blue BMW 228i. I was glad to see it. They detailed it, had it looking like a brand new car sitting on the showroom floor. When I drove off the lot of Passport BMW in Camp Springs, Maryland, it actually felt good to drive my car again. Preston chauffeuring me around had me feeling like a queen, his queen. And I was going to miss it. Especially our little talks to and from work. I pulled into my landsliding neighborhood. My car was looking so good from the detail wax job that I was getting all the looks from county officials. They were all standing by their county vehicles, going over paperwork, still trying to figure out and solve our landslide problem. I finally got to my street. As I pulled into my driveway next to the Charger, Mrs. Taylor was working in her garden. I was in such a good mood, I wasn't going to let her staring at me like I had a third eye bother me. So I got out, smiling all over the place. I couldn't take my eyes off my car. Then I couldn't help but notice it, Mrs. Taylor was staring at me again. Good mood or not, enough was enough. Fed up, I built up enough nerve to confront her about it. I sighed and walked over to Mrs. Taylor as she stood up from her garden to face me. This time the look on her face appeared a little alarming. As nice as I could put it, I said, "Mrs. Taylor, I was wondering if I could ask you something." Mrs. Taylor twiddled her fingers around her small shovel. She seemed nervous, as if she didn't want to say anything. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to startle you." Mrs. Taylor said, "I don't want to." I said, "I'm sorry?" Mrs. Taylor just stood there, losing her words. She didn't look so good. She looked like she was about to get sick. "Mrs. Taylor, is everything okay?" She closed her eyes and sighed. What I was about to say, I don't want to meddle. I looked at her. Meddle? Meddle in what, if I may ask? Her eyes darted over at my house, then back to mine. "Listen, Doris, I understand. I was young once, a long time ago. I understand what it's like to be young, married, and in love." I just looked at her. I didn't know where Mrs. Taylor was coming from. "Okay. It's nothing wrong with being in love and loving your husband. But you have to remember, you have neighbors. And some things need to be private." Still confused, I said, "Like what?" "What needs to be private, Mrs. Taylor?" Mrs. Taylor slipped another look over at the guest room window of my house. I followed her eyes this time. The guest room window was wide open. Not sure where Mrs. Taylor was going with this, I became suspicious. "The noise is coming from the window, Doris," she said. "Noises from what window, Mrs. Taylor?" "That window?" Mrs. Taylor nodded. Now she had this look on her face like she was about to call me a nasty dog. But I was wondering why there was noise coming from my guest room window, where Liana slept. "What kinds of noises?" I asked. "Like music? Loud music?" Mrs. Taylor, staring dead into my eyes like an eye doctor, shook her head in slow motion. Now the look on her face was saying, it was music all right, but it wasn't coming from some stereo or some smartphone music app. Mrs. Taylor had a slight grin on her face now. She knew what kind of noise was coming from my guest room. Like I said, I was young once. A long time ago. I was once married and in love too. But you might want to shut your window. That way your neighbors won't be in your business. I stood there trying to figure it out. And I started wondering. Who could Liana have had over my house having sex with? Was it Phil? Having loud makeup sex in my house? It was all good. Liana's a grown woman, I didn't mind. But Preston wasn't going to be down with it. Especially if it was Phil. Mrs. Taylor still had the slight grin on her face. She said, I've noticed Preston coming home on his lunch break the last week or so. My eyebrows went up like antennas. But Preston doesn't come home for lunch, I said. He never comes home for lunch. It was as if someone walked up to Mrs. Taylor and wiped that grin off her face with a washcloth. Now she was looking at me like someone was in trouble. Deep, deep trouble. Now mystified, Mrs. Taylor said, Doris, you know I know his work truck. Perplexed, I turned and shot a look over at my guest room window. I'm sorry, Mrs. Taylor, I'm a little confused. When did you hear this noise coming from that room? Mrs. Taylor frowned at me. This is strange. Earlier this week, Doris, she said, in a tone that was telling me I must have been losing my mind. I assumed you stayed home from work and Preston came home for lunch to spend time with you. When I figured out what was going on, it felt like a dump truck eased up behind me and let loose a ton of bricks on top of me. I felt sick. I kept swallowing to keep from throwing up at our feet. My body turned up the heat and I started to sweat. Mrs. Taylor gawked at me as if she was about to call 911. Doris, are you okay? She asked. I had to get myself together. Maybe I was jumping to conclusions. Mrs. Taylor, are you sure you heard these noises from my guest room? Mrs. Taylor looked at me like a fortune teller with bad news. Your guest room? And you said you saw Preston's work truck in the driveway. Right? I saw his truck in the driveway, Doris. So I assumed that it was you and him, you and your husband. Spending time together for lunch. Was there a car besides mine parked in front of the house, Mrs. Taylor? Mrs. Taylor thought about it and closed her eyes when she came to a conclusion. I could tell right then and there, by the expression on her face, that she figured it out as well. Now I was sick for real. Doris, that girl, your friend I've seen coming in and out of your house. Is she living with you? Yes she is. But she works during the day. Well, there have been days I've seen her coming and going during work hours. I was feeling woozy. My knees buckled. I leaned back on my heels to hold myself up. I must have started turning colors. Mrs. Taylor, once again, stared at me. And for the first time, I saw empathy in her eyes. Oh my God. Doris, I'm sorry. I just assumed it was you making those noises. Okay, thank you, Mrs. Taylor. All hell was breaking loose in my mind and in my stomach as I headed for my house. Mrs. Taylor was right behind me. Doris, are you okay? It was as if Mrs. Taylor could sense the bloodshed heading for Chris Rancourt in Fort Washington, Maryland. Followed by news trucks and reporters. But this time, not to clean up after a landslide. This time to clean up pools of blood, chunks of brains, and a couple of dead bodies. Tears were struggling to drop, but I held on to them tight. Yes, Mrs. Taylor, I'm okay. You don't look well. Getting the keys out of my purse, I was shaking so bad I dropped them. Lying, I said, I'm fine. Doris. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to get involved in anything. You're fine, Mrs. Taylor, I said, rushing into the house. Thank you. I kicked off my high heels like I was kicking field goals. My shoes bounced and flipped off every wall in the living room. I staggered into the guest room. I stood there, looking around, like I was looking for evidence. Proof. Something. Anything. Then my eyes slid up to the window. It was still open. I leaned forward and sat on the bed. I dropped my head into the cups of my hands and started crying. sitting on the bed where my husband and my best friend made love, loud enough for our neighbor to hear them.